Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Ibn Battuta Part 2, Mongols and Mystics by Extra History. So last time we saw Ibn Battuta's first journey, which was a pilgrimage to Mecca. Now he made that pilgrimage, but then decided, what if I extended my travels a little bit further? Today we'll see where he goes next. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
November 1326, Iraq, Ilkhanate.
Hmm.
Ibn Battuta sits, waiting for the ritual to begin. At the appointed hour come the Sufi mystics. When the afternoon prayers had been said, drums were beaten, and the brethren began to dance, he wrote. They had prepared loads of firewood, which they kindled into flame, and went into the midst of it dancing.
Oh,
Some of them rolled in the fire, others ate it in their mouths,
damn.
until they finally extinguished it entirely. Some of them will take a large snake, and bite its head with their teeth, until they bit it clean through.
What the?
This is Islam, as Ibn Battuta has never seen it, and it
Right.
will make a lasting impression.
Yeah, we talked about this last time, how Ibn Battuta essentially travels around almost the entire Muslim world of this era. And through doing that, he gets a good look at how is Islam practiced differently, right? He sees the different cultures and peoples throughout this very wide span of territory, right? And he'll probably see practices that he is altogether unfamiliar with, especially when he gets further and further afield from his home.
When Ibn Battuta was in Egypt, two separate holy men prophesied that he would travel far to the east
Hmm.
and settle in India. And that made a certain amount of sense. The Sultan of Delhi was actively searching for scholars and judges to fill his bureaucracy, and paying them handsomely. So, when Ibn Battuta
Right, so maybe they weren't telling an incredible prophecy. Maybe they'd just been reading the news. And they're like, you'll probably get to head east and find a job. And he's like, well, that sounds pretty reasonable, actually.
got done with his pilgrimage to Mecca, he decided to just keep going. Because not only was he seeing the world, he was making a profit doing it.
Right.
You see, on his journey, he'd found that rulers often gave pilgrims lavish gifts, and a young Qadi got even more spectacular rewards. He'd heard that the further he got from the Islamic core of the Arabian Peninsula, the more generously a young scholar would be rewarded.
Hmm.
Therefore, he made a vow to
Yeah, I
keep.
mean, maybe he'd find his services more in demand the further afield he went. It's also interesting to see that instead of going home, he sort of continues his journey. Now, that might be because the further he travels, the longer it will take to get home. And so, sort of, the further you go, the more discouraged you are. It's like, well, I could take a quick trip home, but at this point, it's going to take me so long to get back, I might as well just continue my travels a little bit further. And you can see how that can continue to extend and extend and extend.
Keep traveling, to see as much of the world as possible, and to never take the same route if he could avoid it. His eventual goal was India, but he might as well have some fun and make some money on his way there.
Right.
After all, he might spend the rest of his life in India and never get another chance to see this part of the world. So he began his gap year of travel, joining a Persian caravan and crossing out of Mamluk territory, trekking for 44 days into Mesopotamia, into the land of the Khans. A century
Mm.
before, the Mongols had swept into Persia and Iraq, devastating what were, until then, some of the most impressive and advanced cities of the Islamic world. And when Genghis Khan died, his empire split among his four descendants, leaving Persia under a Mongol.
And I like that they pointed out it was not really that simple. It was certainly a whole lot more complex, but we are covering a massive swath of history in a very small period of time here, so there's only so much you can do. You know, we're essentially saying the Mongols, here's what they did. Leave it at that, because we are seeing sort of the existing parts of that when Ibn Battuta arrives. Or
Ruler.
the remaining
But in the
parts.
century since then, the Mongols had converted to Islam and were now patrons of religion and learning. Still, as Ibn Battuta passed through the once mighty city of Baghdad and ruined sites formerly renowned for beauty and scholarship, he reflected on the passing of empire.
Right. Ibn Battuta has and will see some great Islamic cities throughout his journeys, filled with prosperity and trade and education. But Baghdad, he sort of missed its golden age, where it was truly one of, if not the greatest city in the world for all of those things.
And he began to realize another thing. He was now truly abroad. His previous travels had taken him to new places, but this was different. As he left the Arabian Peninsula, he ventured into lands that were still religiously Muslim, but had underlying cultures increasingly divergent from his own.
Right.
Many of the rulers and court figures out here, the people he associated with most, were relatively new converts, second and third generation Muslims, some even first. And their practices at times varied from what Ibn Battuta considered the norm.
Right. Well, when you see these religions that spread wide and far, whether we talk about Islam or Christianity or whatever, Buddhism, any of these types of very popular religions, what you'll find is that, one of the reasons why they're popular and why they're so widespread is that as they expand, locals in certain regions, well, they will embrace those religions, but while embracing them, they'll sort of adopt them into their own cultures and practices. They will take their pre existing cultural practices and usually even their pre existing religious practices, and they'll merge them with, once again, Islam or Christianity or whatever we're talking about. And so, while you're fine, yes, these people are united under the banner of Islam, they'll have a lot of practices that may have come from their culture or their ethnic group or their previous religions or whatever that they have sort of brought into their practice of Islam. And that's why you'll find a lot of different practices, if you go wide and far around the world.
He was about to see Islam in all of its many forms, and that exploration began during his first encounter with Sufi mysticism, a sect that used trance, ritual movement, and chanting as a way to experience God's love on an emotional level, rather than the intellectual manner in which Ibn Battuta was accustomed. The same year, he got to meet the Khan himself, joining the royal caravan,
Wow.
traveling along the Silk Road to see the capital of Khanate. On the way, he visited with the Great Khan, seeing firsthand how the Mongol invaders had become assimilated into Persian culture.
Yeah, and this is often what happens with these types of invaders. I mean, if your idea is to invade, conquer, and rule, which is often the idea, I mean, the Mongols start as a more nomadic people, but as they expand and build their empire, they start to settle down, become more sedentary, and rule these places. And oftentimes, when that happens, of course, they'll bring a lot of aspects of their culture, but you're also going to end up absorbing a lot of the culture and practices of the area in which you're ruling. We see this process time and time again.
Far from a fierce steppe raider, this Khan was a just ruler, a handsome, observant Muslim who played the lute and composed poems in both Persian and Arabic. His kingdom was mighty and powerful. Ibn Battuta did not know it then, but when he next passed through 11 years later, the mighty Ilkhanate would be no more.
Yeah, I was going to say mighty and powerful, for not much longer.
Its ravaged landscape filled with warfare and death. But that's in the future. Now, he bade the Sultan farewell and reached the Khan's capital, exploring its enclaves of Venetian, Genoese, Arab, and Chinese merchants before touring the Euphrates and then heading back to Baghdad. But it was time to get on to India. His gap year of religious tourism was coming to an end. But first, a side trip back to Mecca to make the Hajj pilgrimage again.
Okay.
Because who knew if he'd ever get another chance? Yet that took longer than expected. He'd overextended himself a bit. In 1 year, Ibn Battuta had traveled 4,000 miles.
Wow.
And when he finally arrived back in Mecca, he was so exhausted and ill that after the Hajj, he took a full year to study, pray, and recover. But after that, it was off to Delhi. He went south to the Red Sea, traveling by ship until he was blown off course and became too seasick, so he had to continue his travels on land.
I
often
like
walking
this journey where he's aiming for India, but just keeps getting sidetracked a little bit. Well, I had to go back to Mecca. Well, I had to go here. I had to stay here for a little bit. It's like, okay, well, he's seeing a lot more while he makes this sort of extended journey to India.
across the mountains of Yemen. But eventually, he made it to southern Arabia, where Muslim ports controlled the Indian Ocean trade, where he could get on another ship to India and settle down at a real job. But first, a side trip. I mean, because Africa was right there.
Right.
And look, he might never get back this way again. So he jumped on a ship and went on a port hopping tour
Yeah, I can see why this guy was traveling for more than 20 years now.
of East
He's like me playing Skyrim, where you've got your one main quest in front of you, but, you've got side quests you want to do along the way. And, ooh, you've found this cool landmark. Well, I gotta check this out, right?
Africa, visiting the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, as well as the Muslim courts of Mogadishu, Mombasa, and Zanzibar. There, he saw how Muslim merchants had settled into the ports, converting locals and intermarrying into African families. Their languages
Yeah, once again, we're seeing a blend of different cultures, religions, and practices as these Muslim merchants settle in the area, intermingle with the local populations. You see conversions happening, you see local cultural practices getting mixed in, right? So you see, once again, a mixing and adoption of different cultures.
blending to create what we now know as Swahili. He saw the
You know,
African
this is what happens when you have a very cosmopolitan world, especially revolving around trade. You know, I think people often get the wrong idea when we talk about, say, the Middle Ages, right? We're in the mid 14th century here, that it was a very sort of static place. Everything was in one way or another sort of divided off, right? We talk about the world today and how it's so globalized, which is true, but that doesn't mean that the world of the past was not globalized or interconnected. Sure, less so than today. I mean, the interconnection now is at an all time peak, but you'd always see different cosmopolitan interconnected communities throughout history, right? We see a lot of this.
African families, their languages blending to create what we now know as Swahili. He saw the African section of the vast Indian Ocean trade,
Hmm.
with merchants loading vast quantities of gold, ivory, spices, and perfume ingredients into their triangle rigged ships, along with enslaved Africans captured from kingdoms further inland. And in these port towns,
And we see the slave trade practiced at this time, right? And if you keep in mind, we're in the mid 1300s, especially as we head into the 1400s, a lot of Europeans will begin to pick up on this African slave trade. And then, of course, as we move into the 1500s, as a lot of these European powers begin to conquer territory in the Americas, then the African slave trade is really going to ramp up as the demand ramps up, right? As these European empires bring a lot of these slaves across the Atlantic Ocean, right? But you see the practice pre existing here, and this is sort of what those European powers begin to tap into when we really see the Atlantic slave trade kicking off.
Ibn Battuta first saw
Of course,
society.
this is on the other side of the continent, but they are drawing enslaved people from sort of further inland, right? We're not necessarily talking about the same trade here, right? The two opposite sides of Africa. Keep that in mind. But you do see this sorts of slave trading practices, of course, not just in Africa, but much further afield in Europe, in the Caucasus, in the Middle East. Right? This was not an uncommon trend at that time.
Societies where Muslims were the minority, where the elites and rulers didn't share a religious tie to the majority of their populations.
Right.
But these were no frontier ports. They were cities whose rulers lived in palaces with indoor plumbing. Elites dressed in silk and ate off porcelain, both imports from China. He saw great mosques and mansions carved from coral. Mixed cultures formed from Islam's economic dominance of the maritime networks.
Right, and I don't want to generalize, but you do see a little bit of this. I talked about the sort of intermingling, but sometimes in these types of situations, especially where you see sort of Arabic Muslim merchants settling along the coast, some of these communities are very intermingled, but you can get situations where essentially your sort of elite, particularly economic elite, but also political elite, are made up of these, Muslim Arabic traders, whereas the rest of your population may be more local to the area and may practice different types of religions, right? So you can see sometimes a disconnect between the average person there and this elite sort of trading class, the merchant class.
But again, his time was running short, the monsoon winds changing and blowing back north. So he hopped on a ship back to the Arabian Peninsula, where he could finally travel on to India. But when he arrived on the southern coast of Arabia, he realized it would be cool to see the Gulf of Oman. Though that was a bit of a disaster. Their guide tried to rob and murder him, and Ibn Battuta
Damn.
only escaped after fending the man off with a spear.
Whoa.
He reached the Gulf dehydrated, half dead from illness, and feet bleeding from the trip. It was a close call, and probably an indication that now it was really time to head to Delhi.
Sure.
Become established. But first, a side trip. Back to Mecca for the Hajj for a third time.
Damn.
After another year of study and rest, Ibn Battuta was finally ready for India. For real this time. He'd buffed his resume with qualifications, could tell stories of far-flung places, and had built up a tidy profit in gifts. But the trip itself would be treacherous. And to get there, he needed a guide. And he couldn't find one.
Oh.
Okay, no problem. Because everyone knew that the Turkish Silk Road caravans linked Anatolia with India. And if you joined them, you'd get there eventually.
Mm.
Sure, there were more direct routes, but he'd seen that stuff already. He went to Cairo and met up with a traveling buddy. And reunited, the two stepped onto a Genoese galley and made for Anatolia. And in this land, whose urban centers
Wow, he's going a little further north than I expected. You keep thinking, oh, he's gonna head east now. No, he's heading south and back to Mecca, now north, up into Anatolia on a Genoese galley.
contained neighborhoods of minority Christians, Jews, and Greeks,
Uh-huh.
and where nomadic herders traveled the wild hillsides, they gave him a warm welcome. This country is one of the finest in the world, he wrote. In it, God has brought together the good things dispersed throughout other lands. Its people are the most comely of men, the cleanest in their dress, the most delicious in their food, and the kindliest folk in creation.
Wow, he was a big fan of Anatolia. Shout out.
Wherever we stopped in this land, whether it a hospice or a private house, our neighbors came to ask after our needs. When we left, they bade us farewell as though they were our relatives. He also saw one city execute people by firing them off a cliff with a catapult, but
Damn.
overall, the people were really nice. Interestingly, he found differences in their religious practice. Though observant Muslims, they chewed intoxicating drugs and did not veil women. In fact, Turkish society surprised him when he found out how high a status women had.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, you see different practices of Islam throughout the world. I think even today you'll find, because we're talking about Anatolia, that today would be Turkey, you'll find that in terms of orthodox adherence to Islam, that's not really how Turkey does it. You know what I mean? They're a little more, you could say, loose and casual with their practice.
Now further weighed down with Turkish gifts, he pushed north toward the Silk Road, down the rapids of swollen rivers, nearly freezing to death in the wilderness, avoiding bandits and thieves. But he made it to the Black Sea and boarded a ship for an even stranger place, one of nomads and horsemen, the land of the Golden Horde.
Ooh.
But first, a side trip.
Of course, more side trips. We're getting some more Mongol influence there. That's always interesting. He's done some ship travel, I will point out, but mostly overland. Primarily an overland traveler. So I guess we'll see how that evolves as we go throughout the series. Well, there you go. Another interesting part of Extra History's Ibn Battuta series. I find myself continually interested by all that he observed, experienced on his journey. He's definitely an extremely driven individual, right? He wants to keep going, right? He's not going back. Well, unless it's to Mecca. He keeps going back to Mecca. But other than that, he's going to keep seeing new stuff, which is, of course, why he's such a legend today. So if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all that, hope you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.